Money. We hear a lot about it and we talk a lot about it, and that's what we're going to do in this segment, talk about money. It's a big topic with important implications for the macroeconomy. We'll have to introduce the role of money in the macroeconomy over the course of several segments. In this first one, we examine the following questions. What is money? How is money created in an economy? And what are the roles of commercial banks and the central bank in an economy? First of all, it's important to realize that money isn't income. Income is what you earn from your wages, salaries, profits, or interest payments. So if money isn't income, then what is it? What do all of these objects have in common? At some point in history, all of these were used as a medium of exchange. In other words, they were used as an accepted means of payment for economic transactions. In fact, one of the most important functions of money is that it acts as a medium of exchange. Given the enormous number of transactions that occur in an economy every day, it's not difficult to see why this is one of money's most important functions. Now, what would happen if a medium of exchange loses its value? Suppose we're in a prison camp and cigarettes are the method of exchange. If someone wanted to buy a tin of jam from another prisoner and everyone had stopped smoking, they would no longer accept cigarettes because they in turn could not use them to buy something else. In effect, the money, or the cigarettes in this example, has lost its value, or as we've discovered earlier, it has depreciated, and that's what we called inflation. This is one of the reasons that inflation can create economic instability. It disrupts the ease in which economic transactions are made. In addition to facilitating exchange, money can also be used as a store of value. That means it can be used to make economic transactions at other times and places. So that makes money a financial asset. Finally, money is used as a unit of account. A unit of account is a measure, much like inches, that tells us how much something costs, how much wealth we have, or how much we earn. Any object that satisfies these functions can be money, such as the shells, cigarettes, and dollar bills that we saw earlier. There is, of course, a difference between cigarettes and a dollar bill. Cigarettes, aside for satisfying our three functions of money, can also be smoked. In effect, they have an intrinsic value of their own outside of their use as money. We call such items used as money, but which can also be used for other purposes, commodity money. However, a dollar bill doesn't generally have any value outside of its use as money. Items that are used as medium of exchange, store of value, and unit of account and have no other purpose are called fiat monies. So why would you hold a dollar bill if it is intrinsically worthless? We hold fiat money because the government has declared that a dollar bill is to be accepted as a means of payment. In other words, the dollar bill is legal tender. In fact, if you look at a dollar bill, you'll see the phrase, "This note is legal tender for all debts, public and private." Most governments are also committed to ensuring that the value of their currencies are maintained. In other words, governments won't print so much money that their currencies become worthless. Historically, there are examples of governments that have behaved in a way to debase their currencies by printing money, in effect, causing hyperinflation. We will examine the important link between money and inflation later on. Since we've defined money by the functions it performs, we should see there are many financial assets in addition to an actual dollar that perform more or less these same functions. For example, checking accounts and savings accounts also can act as mediums of exchange, stores of value, and units of account. Consequently, economists have more than one measure of money. The first measure of money is based only on money that can be used directly for transactions purposes, and that's called M1. M1 is composed of currency held outside of banks, plus demand deposits, plus travelers' checks, plus other checkable deposits. It's clear that all of these can be easily used as a medium of exchange. In fact, M1 is the most liquid form of money. Liquidity refers to how easily an asset can be used as a medium of exchange. Currency is the most liquid asset because you can go into a store and buy something without any problem. A house, on the other hand, is not liquid because if you want to buy something with it, you would first need to sell the house, which may take some time. Additional measures of money are based on increasing degrees of illiquidity. For example, after M1 comes M2. M2 includes M1 plus savings accounts, money market accounts, and other near monies. Notice that M2 is slightly less liquid than M1 because to use your money market account for transactions purposes will require that you first convert it into currency and then go shopping. There are other measures of money, M3 and M4, and so on. Fortunately for our purposes, you need only consider M1, the transaction category of money. For the rest of this course, remember that when we say money, we primarily mean currency plus demand deposits. Now that we've defined money, let's see how money enters an economy. To do this, we first look at the role of a financial system and focus on commercial banks and their role in transferring savings to firms who invest in plant and equipment. Recall the general macroeconomic identity for an economy. Y is equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M. This identity tells us that of all the GDP produced in an economy in any given year, the allocation of this output went to households as consumption, firms as investment, government as government spending, and the foreign sector as net exports. Another way to look at the economy is with respect to what we do with the income. Y is equal to C plus X plus T. Of all national income, some gets consumed, some is not consumed, and so this is savings. And some of our income goes for taxes. Since output is equal to income, we can set these two equations equal. C plus I plus G plus X minus M is equal to C plus S plus T, or I plus G plus X minus M is equal to S plus T. Solving for I plus G minus T is equal to S plus M minus X, or borrowing is equal to savings. The C's cancel on each side, and then by manipulating the equation, we get the following. Investment plus the government budget deficit, G minus T, is equal to savings by firms and households, plus the inflow of net foreign savings, or M minus X. Notice that this equation gives us the borrowers on the left side of the equation, firms and the government when it runs a budget deficit, and the sources of savings on the right, private savings plus the inflow of net foreign savings, M minus X. This latter term looks like we are adding in a trade deficit. In fact, when an economy runs a trade deficit, it is only able to do so by borrowing from the rest of the world, which is a net inflow of foreign savings into the United States. By looking at this equation, you should begin to notice that those who do the borrowing are not the same groups as those who do the savings. In fact, this is precisely why economies have financial systems. There must be a mechanism to transfer savings to the borrowers. If savings in an economy were at all kept under a mattress, there would be no funds available for firms to invest in plant and equipment, thus expanding their productive capacity and creating jobs. A financial system is a way in which savings gets allocated to borrowers. Within a financial system, there are both financial markets and financial intermediaries. Financial markets, such as the stock market, directly allocate savings to borrowers. Financial intermediaries instead indirectly allocate savings from savers to borrowers by taking in savings and then finding borrowers for those savings. For example, when you place your money in a bank, which is a financial intermediary, the bank then lends that money out to someone else. This is more efficient than if you had to find a borrower every time you wanted to save and get a return on those savings. Well-functioning financial systems are very important for economies because without them, borrowers would not have access to funds for investment. And remember, it's investment, or what's called capital accumulation, that's important for economic growth. Financial systems can be very complex, especially in today's world with global financial markets and increasing innovations in financial activities. However, the important thing to remember is that the motive in the financial marketplace is to make a profit, and it's this pursuit that results in the allocations of savings to borrowers. One important type of financial intermediary is a commercial bank. Commercial banks are depository institutions that primarily collect savings in the form of deposits and loan these savings out. In fact, we will see that this is a process that actually leads to the creation of money. Once we understand how banks can create money, we will consider the role of the central bank in the process of money supply creation. So how do commercial banks create money? Consider first the balance sheet of a simple commercial bank. The balance sheet is divided between assets and liabilities, which both must be equal for the balance sheet to balance. Assets are simply what you owe, and liabilities are what are owed to you. For our simple bank, the only liabilities it has are the deposits by the public. The bank's liabilities are the loans it makes, plus its net worth. Net worth is the value of the bank to its owners and is defined as assets minus liabilities. Assets equal what is owed to the bank, and liabilities equal what the bank owes to someone. Net worth equals assets minus liabilities, and that's equal to the value of the bank to its owners. We can illustrate the balance sheet of our simple bank using a T account. On the left we have assets, and on the right liabilities. On the left we have loans, and on the right we have deposits and net worth. For a commercial bank to make profits, it takes in deposits and then loans these deposits out. Profit is made when the interest rate on deposits is less than that on loans. This spread represents the profit to the bank. How much of its deposits does a bank loan out? If you really wanted to make a lot of profits, you would try to loan out all of your deposits. However, commercial banks operate within the Federal Reserve System, which is the central bank of the United States. The Fed regulates the banking system and requires that banks retain a certain amount of their deposits, usually between 10 and 12%. This required amount of deposits must be kept in the bank's vault or on deposit at the Fed, where commercial banks also have their own accounts, much like an individual's. The deposits that a commercial bank has at the Fed, plus the currency in the bank's vaults, are called reserves, and the amount of reserves that the bank is required to keep by the Fed are called required reserves. Reserves are deposits that a bank has at the Fed, plus currency held by the bank. Required reserves are the reserves that commercial banks are required to retain as currency on hand or in deposits at the Fed. The fact that commercial banks must retain some of their deposits means that commercial banks are operating in a fractional reserve banking system. Required reserves are important in order to maintain stability in the banking system. The proportion or fraction of deposits that the Fed holds is called the required reserve ratio. The required reserve ratio is the proportion of total deposits that a bank is required to keep as reserves by the Fed. For example, suppose a commercial bank receives $10,000 of new deposits. The bank would now have $10,000 of reserves. If the required reserve ratio is 12%, then the bank must hold $1,200 as required reserves. The remaining reserves, $10,000 less $1,200 or $8,800, are called excess reserves, which can be loaned out. Reserves are equal to $10,000. Required reserves equals 12%, which is 0.12. Required reserves then are $10,000 times 0.12, which is equal to $1,200. excess reserves are equal to actual reserves minus required reserves. And that's equal to $10,000 minus $1,200, or $8,800. So, given this background, how do banks create money? Remember, money is currency plus demand deposits. If you've ever taken a loan out or know of someone who has, generally the bank gives the money to the borrower by creating a deposit in the borrower's name. For example, if I want to borrow $9,000 to fix my house, the bank loans me the money by creating a deposit account in my name equal to the sum of $9,000. Since money is defined as deposits plus currency, the bank, by giving me the loan, just created $9,000 in a new deposits, so the money supply increased by that amount. It's that simple. Banks create money by loaning out excess reserves. The money supply is equal to reserves times the money multiplier. It turns out that 1 over the required reserve ratio, 1 over R, is the money multiplier and tells us the maximum increase in the money supply that's due to an initial amount of reserves. For Noah's Bank, we would have the money supply equals $10,000 times 1 over 0.1, or $10,000 times 10, which is equal to $100,000, where the money multiplier is 10, telling us that for every $1 of new deposits, the money supply would be equal to a stock, or $10. Now, if we want to see how banks create money, we only have to remember that we started with $10,000 of money. And when this money was deposited in the bank and loaned out, the money supply would be $100,000. So the bank actually created $90,000 of money. This brings us to a very interesting question. Is the supply of money important for economic activity? It appears so because we have just seen it's related to the amount of lending in an economy, and this could be important. There are also implications between money supply and inflation. The supply of money can potentially be very important for economic activity. Given this, how does the Fed intervene to attempt to influence the supply of money? From our equation regarding money supply, we have the money supply equals to the reserves times the money multiplier. So changes in the money supply, or DM, is equal to DR times 1 over R. From this equation, we can see that the Fed has a very influential way to influence the money supply by changing the required reserve ratio. So the Fed can change the money multiplier. If the Fed lowers the required reserve ratio, banks can make more loans and the money supply can potentially increase. Raising the required reserve ratio would decrease the ability of banks to make loans because they would have to hang on to more required reserves, and so the money supply would decrease. This is an important part. It affects the behavior of all depository institutions. However, the Fed doesn't use this in its day-to-day activities because it makes it too difficult for banks to plan how to arrange their portfolios. So, is there another way the Fed can influence the supply of money? Well, looking at our formula, it appears that if the Fed could influence the amount of reserves in the banking system, it could influence the supply of money. And in fact, this is a very important part of Fed policy. Let's see how it works. First of all, let's talk a little bit about the Fed. For the organizational structure of the Fed and its many functions, see your textbook. The Fed can be considered as the banker's bank with a very important function of being the lender of last resort and setting monetary policy. The Fed is different from the U.S. Treasury. The Treasury Department is responsible for collecting taxes and paying the bills of the federal government. The Treasury Department can't print money. It can borrow money just like anyone else if there's a shortfall of revenues, or what we call a budget deficit. The Fed, being a bank, also has assets and liabilities. The main assets and liabilities of the Fed are given in the following T account, with the approximate proportions in parentheses for 1993. Gold, 3%. Federal Reserve notes outstanding, 87%. Loans to banks, 0.02%. Deposits of bank reserves, 8%. U.S. government securities 82%, deposits from U.S. Treasury 1%, other assets 15%, other liabilities and net worth 4%. The primary assets of the Fed are U.S. government securities, which are bonds sold by the U.S. government. The primary liability of the Fed are Federal Reserve notes outstanding, or currency. The most important liability of the Fed in terms of its influence of the money supply is the deposit of bank reserves. Recall that if reserves in the banking systems go up, banks can make more loans, thus creating more money. If reserves in the banking system decrease, then banks can make less loans and the supply of money goes down. For the Fed, then, to influence the supply of money in the economy, it must somehow change the amount of reserves in the banking system. Now, how does it do this? The Fed influences the amount of reserves in the banking system through open market operations. Open market operations are the purchase and sale by the Fed of U.S. government securities in the open market. The Fed, which holds a large amount of U.S. government securities, can buy and sell those securities in the bond markets, and it's this process that will expand and contract bank reserves as follows. Consider the following set of T accounts, which include the Fed, a commercial bank, and an economic agent such as a pension fund. For the Fed, we have $10 of U.S. government securities, $10 of deposits of commercial bank reserves. For the commercial bank, liabilities are $10 on deposit at the Fed and $10 of deposits of the economic agent. For the economic agent, liabilities are $10, which is deposits at the commercial bank, and $10 of net worth. Notice that the economic agent has $10 of deposits at the commercial bank, which is a liability for the commercial bank, but also increases the reserves of the commercial bank. The commercial bank, in turn, deposits these reserves at the Fed. The Fed also has assets of U.S. government securities. Now suppose that the Fed decides to sell $10 worth of government securities, and the economic agent decides to buy them. What happens in the banking system with respect to reserves? First of all, from the point of view of the economic agent, they buy $10 worth of securities and pay for them by writing a check to the Fed. The T account of the economic agent is now given by $10 U.S. government securities, $10 net worth. Notice that the agent has simply switched portfolios from deposits at the commercial bank to a U.S. government security. Now, what happens to the check that the agent wrote for the securities? The check was made out to the Fed, and so the Fed then cashes the check. Notice that by cashing the check, the commercial bank's deposits fall by the amount of the check, and so the commercial bank's reserves also fall by the same amount, since deposits equal reserves. The commercial bank and the Fed's balance sheets are now like this. For the commercial banks, 0, no more reserves on deposit of the Fed, and 0, no more deposits of the economic agent. For the Fed, 0, that sold the government securities to an agent, and 0, no more deposits of commercial banks. The Fed no longer has the U.S. government securities which were sold to the economic agent, and the Fed no longer has liabilities of the commercial banks since reserves have dropped. In effect, the Fed, by cashing the check from the agent, decreases liabilities against itself. Now, what is the effect of this sale of U.S. government securities on bank reserves? Reserves have declined by the amount of the sale of U.S. government securities. This would imply that commercial banks now have less reserves to loan out, and so the money supply will contract by the decline in reserves times the money multiplier. If the required reserve ratio was 10%, then this open market operation resulted in a change in the money supply, or delta R times 1 over R, which is equal to $10 times 1 divided by 0.10, which is equal to 100. A decrease in the money supply of $100. The reverse happens when the Fed decides to buy $5 worth of securities, and in that case, reserves increase, so the money supply can increase. What we see then is the sale of government securities by the Fed decreases reserves in the banking system, thus reducing the supply of money. Purchase of government securities by the Fed increases reserves in the banking system, thus increasing the supply of money. And it's through open market operations that the Fed primarily attempts to control the supply of money in an economy. Let's assume that the Fed has complete control over the money supply by expanding and contracting reserves through open market operations. We can then represent the supply of money with respect to interest rates as a vertical curve. However, be aware that even though we are acting like the Fed has complete control of the money supply, in practice this is not generally the case. Recall that money supply depends not only on the amount of reserves in the banking system, but also on the fact that banks would lend out excess reserves, creating new loans and so increasing the money supply. If banks are more aggressive in making loans, the money supply will expand by a greater amount. If banks are less aggressive in making loans, the money supply will expand by a lesser amount. How many loans banks desire to make depends on other factors, most importantly, how profitable banks thinking making loans will be. If the economy is heading into a recession, banks may extend fewer loans because they think that the probability or the likelihood of getting repaid will increase. If the economy is heading into an economic expansion, banks may extend more loans because the probabilities of loan default are decreasing. The upshot of this is that the same amount of increase in bank reserves as a result of an open market purchase of government securities by the Fed may have different impacts on the supply of money at different periods of economic growth.